December 1944. The Ardennes forest. A shroud of freezing fog clings to the pines. Snow deadens all sound, swallowing the rumble of the approaching engine until the last possible moment. Headlights slice through the gloom. A Willys Jeep, its canvas top stiff with ice, slows to a halt. Inside, 4 men in American greatcoats sit motionless. Their M1 rifles are held correctly. Their helmets are standard issue, but they are silent, too silent. Ahead, a makeshift roadblock. A young GI, barely 20, steps forward, his breath pluming in the frigid air. His knuckles are white on the stock of his rifle. He is cold, exhausted, and deeply afraid. The men in the Jeep had been trained for this moment. Trained to kill, to sabotage, to deceive. But they had not been trained for the one simple question that could unravel it all. A question about a comic strip character or the capital of Illinois. For behind American lines, a new and terrifying weapon had been unleashed against them. Autumn 1944. A season of victory. But victory has a price. The Allied armies, having shattered the German defenses in Normandy during Operation Cobra, had blazed across France in a historic advance. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Brussels followed on September 3rd. The momentum seemed unstoppable. A wave of optimism swept through the Allied High Command. General Eisenhower and his subordinates, Bradley and Montgomery, began planning for the final push into Germany itself. The prevailing wisdom was simple. The war would be over by Christmas. But the speed of the Allied pursuit had created its own crisis. Supply lines, stretching all the way back to the beaches of Normandy, were strained to the breaking point. The Red Ball Express, a heroic convoy of thousands of trucks running day and night, could not keep up. Fuel, ammunition, food, and winter clothing became dangerously scarce at the front. The advance, once a torrent, slowed to a crawl. The autumn rains came, turning roads into quagmires and grounding the all-powerful Allied air forces. Facing them, the German Wehrmacht was not yet dead. Beaten and bloodied, it had been pushed back to its own frontier. Here, it found a formidable line of defense it had built years before. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, a belt of concrete pillboxes, dragon's teeth tank traps, and fortified positions stretching for hundreds of miles. On their own soil, fighting for their homeland, German resistance stiffened dramatically. The easy gains of the summer were over. A brutal, grinding war of attrition began in places like the Hürtgen forest, costing thousands of American lives for mere yards of ground. Amid this stalemate, one sector of the front remained eerily quiet. The Ardennes, a rugged, hilly expanse of dense forest, deep ravines, and narrow, winding roads straddling the border of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Allied planners considered it unsuitable for a major offensive, for either side. The terrain was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. It became a designated ghost front, a place to send green, untested American divisions like the 106th Infantry to get their first taste of the line. A place for battered, exhausted units like the 28th Infantry to rest and refit after the horrors of the Hürtgen. The American line here was thin, manned by soldiers who believed they were in the safest place on the Western Front. They were catastrophically wrong. For behind the Siegfried Line, in the utmost secrecy, Adolf Hitler was massing the last great reserve of his military power. 3 full German armies, nearly 250,000 men, and over 1,000 tanks and assault guns. He had conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity, a final, desperate gamble to reverse the course of the war in the West. Codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its objective was to punch through the weak American lines in the Ardennes, race to the Meuse River, and then seize the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp. The blow, Hitler believed, would split the British and American armies, trap 4 of them against the sea, and force the Western Allies to sue for a negotiated peace. He could then turn his full might against the Soviet Union in the East. The plan depended entirely on speed, surprise, and the foul winter weather that would keep Allied planes on the ground. The armored spearheads of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies would form the mailed fist of the attack. But Hitler's plan contained another layer, a weapon aimed not at fortifications or tank columns, but at the trust that holds an army together. This weapon had a name, Operation Greif, Griffin, and it had an architect. Waffen-SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. A towering Austrian commando with a dueling scarred face, Skorzeny had cultivated a legend. In 1943, he had snatched Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a remote mountaintop hotel in a daring glider raid. He had kidnapped the son of Hungary's regent to keep the country in the war. He was Hitler's specialist in the impossible, the man summoned for audacious, unconventional operations. For the Ardennes offensive, Hitler gave him his most ambitious assignment yet. Operation Greif was two-pronged. The main component was Panzer Brigade 150, a force of roughly 2,000 men and a handful of tanks. Their task was overt, if deceptive. Dressed in American uniforms and driving captured or disguised American vehicles, they were to advance with the leading panzer divisions. Their primary objective, to seize at least 2 vital bridges over the Meuse River between Liège and Namur, holding them intact until the 6th Panzer Army arrived. They were a Trojan horse, a mailed fist wrapped in a stolen glove. But hidden within Greif was a far more insidious element. A small, specialized commando unit of around 150 men, known as Einheit Stielau. These were the men who had to be fluent in English, preferably with an American accent and a mastery of contemporary slang. They were organized into small 4- or 5-man teams, equipped with captured jeeps. Their mission was not to seize bridges, but to infiltrate deep behind American lines in the initial hours of the assault. They were chaos agents. Their orders were to spread maximum confusion. They would switch road signs, misdirect American reinforcements, cut telephone wires, and spread demoralizing rumors of a German breakthrough. They were to create phantom traffic jams, report non-existent minefields, and identify Allied command posts for the Luftwaffe. They were a scalpel, designed to sever the nerves of the American army. The call went out across the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. Volunteers were needed for a special mission, men who could speak English. They were gathered in secret at a training camp in Grafenwöhr, Bavaria. There, they were rapidly drilled. They studied American military ranks, insignia, and drill procedures. They watched American movies to pick up mannerisms and slang. They were taught to smoke and hold cigarettes like GIs, to chew gum, to mimic the casual slouch of a battle-weary American soldier. The training was frantic, compressed into just a few weeks. There was no time for perfection. The logistical challenge was immense. Skorzeny's requests for 150 American tanks, 200 armored cars, and hundreds of trucks and jeeps were impossible to fulfill. The German war machine was collapsing. What arrived was a motley collection of captured equipment, much of it damaged or obsolete. Only a handful of genuine Sherman tanks were procured. The rest of Panzer Brigade 150's armor consisted of German Panther tanks, crudely disguised with sheet metal plates to vaguely resemble American M10 tank destroyers. The deception would not survive close inspection. The supply of American uniforms was equally poor. Many were sourced from captured summer-issue stocks, wholly inadequate for the Ardennes winter. Others were British. The men were issued counterfeit American dog tags, pay books, and identification papers. Every detail was a potential giveaway. Skorzeny knew the risks. Under the Hague Convention, soldiers caught fighting in enemy uniforms could be summarily executed as spies. He gave his men a dubious legal assurance. They would only violate the laws of war if they actually fired their weapons while wearing the American uniform. For infiltration and deception, he argued. It was a legitimate ruse de guerre. It was a fine distinction that would offer little comfort to a man facing an American firing squad. On the eve of the offensive, these commandos, ill-equipped but highly motivated, moved up to the front line. They were a desperate gamble within a larger, even more desperate gamble. A few hundred men preparing to sow a level of confusion and fear far disproportionate to their numbers, becoming ghosts behind the lines. The German offensive struck with the force of a physical blow. But the news that followed spread like a virus. It whispered through command posts, down frozen telephone lines, and from one foxhole to the next. The enemy was not just in front. He was behind. He was beside you. He wore your uniform, drove your jeep, and spoke your language. Fear, colder and more penetrating than the Ardennes winter, took hold. An army's greatest asset, trust in the man next to you, began to fray. Every stranger became a suspect. Every unfamiliar accent, a death sentence. Checkpoints sprang up at every crossroads, manned by tense, trigger-happy GIs. They became impromptu tribunals where life and death hung on questions of American culture. Who is Betty Grable's husband? What's the capital of Illinois? Who plays for the Yankees? A wrong answer. A moment's hesitation could be fatal. A British officer, unable to name the winner of the World Series, was held for hours. An American brigadier general was detained when he correctly identified Chicago as the largest city in Illinois. But his interrogator mistakenly believed the capital, Springfield, was the correct answer. The questions were a desperate, clumsy defense against a phantom menace. For the common soldier, the front was no longer a clear line on a map. It was everywhere. The enemy was a ghost, and the psychological damage he inflicted was far greater than any bridge he failed to capture. The tactical angle. The nerve war. The initial reports reaching American headquarters were chaotic, often dismissed as battlefield rumor. But as the trickle of information became a flood, a terrifying picture emerged. This was not random panic. It was a coordinated campaign of disruption. A single team from Einheitsstielau could sever the communication wire to an entire battalion, leaving it deaf and blind at the most critical moment. Another could reverse a few road signs, sending a vital column of Sherman tanks on a 10-mile detour down a muddy, indefensible track. The physical damage was minimal, but the tactical impact was immense. It injected friction and doubt into every American action and reaction. The Allied High Command responded swiftly. On December 17th, Schaff issued a theater-wide warning, broadcasting the description of Skorzeny's commandos. The alert triggered a massive security lockdown. The rumor mill, fed by the commandos' deliberate misinformation, went into overdrive. The most potent rumor alleged that Skorzeny's primary objective was the assassination or capture of General Eisenhower himself. True or not, the threat was taken seriously. Ike became a virtual prisoner in his Versailles headquarters, surrounded by a ring of guards and military police. The supreme commander of the Allied war effort was pinned down not by a panzer division, but by a ghost story. Operation Greif had failed in its strategic goal of seizing the Meuse bridges, but it had succeeded beyond Skorzeny's wildest dreams as an instrument of psychological warfare. The German angle, the imposter's gambit. For the men of Einheitsstielau, crossing the lines was a plunge into the abyss. They were a handful of teams in captured jeeps, swallowed by the chaos of the American retreat. Every moment was a performance. Every salute, every casual wave to a passing GI was a rehearsed line. The strain was unimaginable. Their American slang, learned from movies, was often dated. Their uniforms were sometimes British. Their Panther tanks, crudely disguised as M10s, were a dead giveaway to any trained eye. They were operating on a razor's edge, where a single slip of the tongue meant a trip to a ditch and a firing squad. A few teams achieved notable success. They misdirected an American regiment. They scouted artillery positions. They reported phantom minefields that delayed reinforcements. But they were always alone, cut off, and hunted. On December 17th, near Iwila, an American patrol stopped a German jeep. The commandos inside gave the correct password, but a sergeant noticed their vehicle was improperly marked. Under questioning, their story crumbled. They were captured, and their papers confirmed the existence and mission of Operation Greif. The secret was out. For the other teams still operating behind the lines, the danger intensified tenfold. They were no longer just infiltrators. They were now the specific targets of a furious, theater-wide manhunt. The manhunt was not a wild chase. It was a methodical, cold-blooded affair, orchestrated by an obscure branch of the U.S. Army, the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC. These were the hunters, plainclothes agents and uniformed specialists trained to fight a war of deception. They moved between the lines, from chaotic command posts to frozen roadblocks, sifting truth from rumor. Their weapon was not the M1 rifle, but the carefully crafted question. They established the system of cultural tripwires, feeding questions to the MPs and GIs at every checkpoint. They knew the German training was rushed. They knew the weak points would be cultural, not military. The name of a baseball player. The lyrics to a popular song. The subtle difference between an American and a British salute. CIC agents were tasked with interrogating every suspect. They worked in frigid tents and commandeered farmhouses, facing men who knew their lives were forfeit. They were looking for the slightest inconsistency, the slip of a vowel, the flicker of uncertainty in an eye. Their job was to peel back the layers of a perfect performance to find the German soldier beneath. It was a grim, exhausting process. For every genuine commando they unmasked, they had to clear dozens of terrified, legitimate GIs who had simply forgotten the name of Mickey Mouse's dog. The CIC was America's immune system, fighting the infection of paranoia from within, trying to restore the trust that Operation Greif was designed to kill. They were the true secret weapon, fighting a shadow war in the chaos of the Bulge. The propaganda angle, the myth machine. The reality of Operation Greif was a handful of teams achieving minor, localized disruption. But the idea of Operation Greif became a weapon of immense power. It escaped the battlefield and infected the mind of the entire Allied war effort. Newspapers in London and New York ran sensationalist headlines about phantom parachutists and German assassins. The story of the plot to kill Eisenhower became a legend, whispered with a mix of awe and terror. Skorzeny, once a name known only to intelligence circles, was transformed into a near mythical figure, a larger-than-life supervillain lurking behind every tree. The fear he generated was his greatest success. Allied commanders had to divert precious manpower to security details. Convoys were delayed for hours at checkpoints. The entire rear echelon of the American army became obsessed with the internal threat. This psychological victory was not lost on the Germans. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry seized on the Allied panic, broadcasting stories that wildly exaggerated the scope and success of the operation. They painted a picture of thousands of commandos running rampant, of American command collapsing into chaos. It was a rare propaganda coup in the final, desperate months of the war. In this, the Germans succeeded completely. They had created a fifth column out of thin air, a ghost that haunted the Allied army long after the last commando team was captured or killed. The physical damage was negligible. The psychological scar was deep and lasting. The judicial angle. The price of deception for the commandos of Einheit Stielau. Capture was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of a final, unwinnable legal fight. They were not afforded the protections of the Geneva Convention. They were not prisoners of war. They were spies. The distinction was critical. Under the laws of war, a soldier captured in his own uniform is a POW. A soldier captured in the enemy's uniform, operating behind their lines, is an illegal combatant. The penalty was death. Skorzeny's flimsy legal justification that they would only be spies if they fought in the uniform evaporated under the harsh light of a military tribunal. The act of deception itself, the infiltration for the purpose of sabotage and confusion, was enough. Swift, secret trials were convened by military commission. The evidence was often overwhelming. The counterfeit papers, the American uniforms, the captured jeeps, their own confessions under interrogation. The proceedings were brief, stripped of ceremony. There was no jury, only a panel of American officers. The verdict was almost always the same: guilty. The sentence: death by firing squad. It was a stark, brutal calculus of war. These men had accepted a mission with extraordinary risks, believing they were serving their country. Now, they faced the ultimate consequence of that mission, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, procedural finality of military justice. For 18 captured commandos, this legal process would lead them to a final, lonely rendezvous in a Belgian town. That final rendezvous would come. But first, the hunt had to begin. It began not with a firefight, but with a moment of doubt at a lonely crossroads. December 17th, 1944, near the village of Iwile, Belgium. The second day of the German offensive. The American front line is a shattered, chaotic mess of retreat and desperate defense. A single jeep approaches a hastily erected checkpoint. Inside, 3 men in American uniforms. They look the part. Their vehicle is correct. But something is wrong. A military policeman, Private First Class Francis Curry of the 120th Infantry, feels it. The driver's response to a question is slightly off. His salute is not quite right. A flicker of hesitation. It is enough. The men are ordered out of the jeep. They are separated, interrogated. Their story, rehearsed for weeks in a Bavarian training camp, begins to fray at the edges. One man's accent is too thick. Another cannot answer a simple question about a baseball score. Their papers are examined. They are good forgeries, but under the scrutiny of a trained CIC agent, they are not perfect. The search of their jeep yields the final, damning evidence. A German sold book, a bundle of German currency, a copy of Skorzeny's orders for Operation Grafe, outlining the entire mission. The ghosts now had names. Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing, Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt. They were the first of Einheit Stielau to be unmasked. The intelligence they provided under interrogation was a bombshell. It confirmed the wildest rumors. The existence of a dedicated commando force in American uniforms. The mission to sow chaos. The objective to seize the Meuse bridges. The name of their commander, Otto Skorzeny. The information shot up the chain of command with the speed of a telegraph signal. From the CIC field office to 1st Army headquarters. From there to Bradley's 12th Army Group and Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters. The vague threat of infiltrators solidified into a hard, verifiable fact. The theater-wide alert was issued immediately. Every MP, every officer, every GI on the line was now officially on the hunt. The paranoia that had been a creeping fog now became a raging storm. The capture of 3 men in a single jeep had turned tens of thousands of American soldiers into a vast, if clumsy, counterintelligence network. For Pernis, Billing, and Schmidt, the war was over. But their ordeal was just beginning. They were not sent to a prisoner of war cage. They were designated spies. Illegal combatants stripped of all protections. They were taken to the headquarters of the 1st U.S. Army in the town of Spa, Belgium. There, on December 21st, they faced a military commission. The trial was swift. The evidence was absolute. Their own confessions, the captured documents, the American uniforms they were wearing when caught. There was no defense. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, dictated by the unforgiving laws of war. Guilty. The sentence was announced without ceremony. Death. 6 days after their capture, in the pre-dawn chill of December 23rd, the 3 Germans were led from their cells. They were taken to a field near the village of Henri-Chapelle. A row of wooden posts stood starkly against the gray, winter sky. They were blindfolded and tied. A chaplain offered final prayers. An American officer read the charges and the sentence. In the distance, the rumble of the front-line artillery was a constant, dull thunder. A firing squad of American soldiers from the 746th Tank Battalion took their positions. They raised their M1 rifles. The execution was a clear and brutal message, intended for any other German commandos still hiding behind the lines. This is your fate. There is no escape. No quarter will be given. But as the shots echoed across the frozen fields of Henri-Chapelle, the message was also a confession of fear. The American army was now executing men for what they represented. And what they represented was still out there, in the snow-covered forests. Other teams, other imposters. And the most dangerous part of Skorzeny's plan, the armored fist inside the stolen glove, had not yet been broken. It was moving toward a vital crossroads, a place where the fate of the entire battle would be decided. That crossroads was the small Belgian town of Malmedy. By December 21st, it had become a critical bottleneck, a bastion held by a determined mix of American engineers and infantry. Men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and the 120th Infantry Regiment had turned the town into a fortress of roadblocks and strong points. They were exhausted, cold, and outnumbered. But they had been warned. They knew about the imposters. They were watching, waiting. In the pre-dawn darkness, the grinding clatter of tank treads echoed from the south. A column of armored vehicles emerged from the swirling snow. They appeared to be American. M10 tank destroyers, jeeps, half-tracks. The men wore U.S. Army greatcoats. It was Panzer Brigade 150, or what was left of it, making its desperate bid to break through to the Meuse. Skorzeny's armored fist was about to strike. The column rumbled toward the first American roadblock. The lead vehicle, a disguised Panther tank, slowed. The German commander, hoping the deception would hold, prepared to bluff his way through. But in the gloom, a pair of American eyes saw what the darkness was meant to hide. The suspension was wrong. The muzzle brake on the main gun, was German. The crude sheet metal tacked onto the Panther's hull could not disguise its predatory silhouette from a trained soldier. The whisper went down the line. Germans. There was no negotiation, no demand for a password. There was only the sudden, violent eruption of fire. A 57mm anti-tank gun, hidden in a building, opened up at point-blank range. The first shell slammed into the lead Panther, staggering it. Bazooka teams, lying in wait in snow-filled ditches, sent rockets screaming into the sides of the German armor. The night ignited with tracer fire and explosions. The deception, so carefully planned, was instantly and violently shredded. The battle for Malmedy became a street-by-street brawl in the dark. The German commandos, trapped in their burning vehicles, fought back with desperation. But they were caught in a perfectly laid trap. The American engineers, masters of demolition and defense, had turned every house into a pillbox, every street corner into a kill zone. The disguised Panthers, formidable weapons in open country, were clumsy and vulnerable in the narrow streets. One by one, they were disabled, their crews cut down as they tried to escape. The attack faltered. The momentum was lost. The element of surprise had not just been negated. It had been turned against them. The American uniforms that were meant to be their shield had only drawn them deeper into the ambush. By sunrise, the German assault had completely broken. The survivors retreated back into the forest, leaving behind a graveyard of their special equipment. Burning Panthers, their sheet metal disguises peeling away in the heat, littered the approaches to Malmedy. The armored fist of Operation Grief had been shattered against the anvil of the American defense. The grand strategic objective, the seizure of the Meuse bridges, was now an impossible dream. The Trojan horse had been stopped at the gate. Skorzeny's brigade was reduced to a conventional fighting unit, its special purpose utterly defeated. The failure was absolute. The armored fist had been shattered. But the ghosts it had unleashed were still being hunted in the frozen woods, their individual fates now sealed by the brigade's very public failure. The sun rose on a scene of total defeat. Malmedy was a graveyard of ambition. The hulks of Skorzeny's disguised Panthers smoldered in the frozen streets, their sheet metal masks warped and blackened by fire. They were monuments to a failed deception. The bodies of German commandos, clad in American wool, lay frozen in the snow beside their wrecked vehicles. Panzer Brigade 150 had ceased to exist as a special operations force. Its losses were catastrophic. In the failed assault, it had lost most of its irreplaceable disguised armor and suffered hundreds of casualties. On December 28th, what remained of the unit was officially dissolved and absorbed by the 6th Panzer Army. The mailed fist had been broken. With the failure of the armored spearhead, the scattered teams of Einheitsstielau were now truly ghosts. They were adrift in a sea of enemies, their primary mission rendered meaningless. The German offensive was stalling. The American lines were solidifying. There would be no link-up. There was no escape. The manhunt, already at a fever pitch, became a grim and methodical process of elimination. One by one, the remaining Jeep teams were cornered. A team was captured after stopping to ask an American MP for directions. Another was caught when they failed to recognize the password of the day. A CIC agent, Captain John Ott, noted in his report the telltale signs they looked for. The way a German buckled his belt from the opposite side, the distinctive hobnails on their boots hidden beneath American leggings, their tendency to count on their fingers starting with the thumb. Every detail was a potential noose. And of the roughly 40 commandos who successfully infiltrated the lines, nearly all were captured or killed within a week. For those taken alive, the path was short and unalterable. The precedent set by the execution of the first 3 commandos at Henri-Chapelle became the rule. Military commissions were convened with chilling efficiency at First Army headquarters. The trials were not about guilt or innocence in the conventional sense. They were a confirmation of fact. Was the accused a German soldier? Was he captured behind American lines? Was he wearing an American uniform? If the answers were yes, the verdict was guilty, and the sentence was death. Between December 23, 1944, and January 13, 1945, a total of 18 members of Operation Grief were executed by American firing squads. Some met their end at Henri-Chapelle. Others faced their executioners in the courtyard of the citadel in the Belgian town of Huy. They were shot in small groups, a final grim chapter in Hitler's desperate Ardennes gamble. They had been sent to sever the nerves of the American army. Instead, they were surgically excised, their mission a tactical and strategic failure. The physical threat posed by Operation Grief was over. The last imposter had been caught, the last disguised tank destroyed. But the weapon Skorzeny had unleashed was not made of steel. It was made of fear, and fear, once planted, does not die so easily. The execution of 18 men could not kill the story they had created. That question, born in the chaos of a winter battle, would never be fully answered. The line between soldier and spy, it turned out, was drawn not in law books, but in the snow of a Belgian winter, by the men holding the rifles. In the Ardennes, the uniform, for centuries, the most sacred symbol of a soldier's identity and allegiance, became a mask. And the enemy was no longer just a man in a different colored coat across a field. He was a reflection in a mirror. Operation Grief was a military failure. It did not capture its objectives or change the course of the battle. But its psychological success was profound and lasting. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a future where deception, misinformation, and the deliberate erosion of trust would become weapons as potent as any tank or artillery piece. The battlefield would no longer be confined to maps and front lines. It would extend into the human mind itself. The real weapon was not the disguised panther, but the seed of doubt planted in a cold, tired soldier's heart. The questions about baseball players and state capitals were more than trivia. They were a desperate shield against the unknown, a fragile attempt to restore order to a world turned upside down. The 18 men who faced the firing squads were not executed for the bridges they failed to take, but for the certainty they had destroyed. They were the price paid for a lesson learned in fear, a lesson that in the final, brutal calculus of total war, an army's most vulnerable point is not its flank, but its faith in itself. Today, the forests of the Ardennes are quiet. The trees have healed. The snows return each winter, covering the old foxholes and forgotten crossroads. But the memory of that fear remains, a quiet testament to a time when American soldiers hunted ghosts in their own ranks. And the most dangerous question one man could ask another was simply, "Who are you?" That story became the true legacy of Operation Grief. The ghost of Skorzeny's Commandos would haunt the U.S. Army for the rest of the war. The intense paranoia of the Bulge slowly subsided, but it never vanished completely. Checkpoint procedures were formalized. Counterintelligence awareness became a mandatory part of training for new arrivals. The American military, a force that had prided itself on its straightforward, overwhelming power, had been forced to learn the dark art of suspicion. It had been taught a brutal lesson, that an enemy you cannot see can be more disruptive than one you can. The trust that had been broken in the Ardennes was never again so absolute. Every soldier in the rear echelon was now a potential sentinel, a guard against an internal threat that might not even exist. For Otto Skorzeny, the operation was a tactical failure, but a personal triumph. The Allied press, fueled by the panic his men had caused, transformed him from a skilled but obscure commando into a legend. He was the most dangerous man in Europe, a master of disguise, a phantom who could strike anywhere. This myth-making served both sides. For German propaganda, it was a heroic tale of audacity in the face of certain defeat. For the Allies, it gave a face to their fear, a single villain to hold responsible for the chaos. In 1947, Skorzeny sat in a courtroom at Dachau, facing an Allied military tribunal. He was charged with war crimes, the principal accusation being the illegal use of enemy uniforms during the Ardennes offensive. The prosecution presented a simple case. Skorzeny's men had violated the Hague Convention, acting as spies, not soldiers. The 18 commandos executed by American firing squads were proof of the crime. Skorzeny's defense was equally simple. He argued his men were instructed not to fight in American uniforms, only to use them for infiltration, a legitimate ruse de guerre. The trial took a stunning turn. A surprise witness was called for the defense. Wing Commander F.F.E. Yeo Thomas, a decorated British secret agent of the Special Operations Executive. On the stand, Yeo Thomas testified under oath that Allied agents, himself included, had worn German uniforms and used enemy equipment behind the lines. The revelation sent a shockwave through the court. To convict Skorzeny would be to convict their own. The tribunal had no choice. Skorzeny was acquitted of the charges relating to Operation Greif. The verdict exposed the deep hypocrisy and the murky legal reality of unconventional warfare. The line between a commando and a spy, between a legitimate ruse and a war crime, was not a clear, bright line drawn by international law. It was a shifting gray boundary, often determined by which side you were on and whether you won or lost. The 18 executed Germans had paid the price for that ambiguity on the battlefield. Skorzeny, their commander, had navigated it successfully in a courtroom. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately won by American grit, artillery, and the clearing skies that finally unleashed the Allied air forces. Operation Greif did not seize a single Meuse bridge. It did not change the outcome of the battle or the war. But it achieved something more insidious. It demonstrated that a handful of men, armed with a clever idea and the enemy's own uniform, could weaponize fear itself. They proved that in modern warfare, the battle for the mind was as critical as the battle for ground. This new kind of warfare left behind a question that echoed long after the guns fell silent. Where does the soldier end and the spy begin?